We'll give folks just a minute or two. We have someone else joining from the waiting room. Make sure everyone can get in. As they're joining, I just want to say welcome on behalf of the Center for Ideas and Society. My name is Catherine. I'm here with my co-host and director of the center, Georgia Warkey. Also here with our guest speakers who we'll introduce in just a moment, but for many of you, I'm sure they need no introduction. We're coming to you from Southern California, where the University of California, Riverside has its home, as do many of us, and the land under our feet has been tended and cared for generations by the Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Luiseño and Serrano peoples, and we are grateful to acknowledge our debt to them, to their care for the land, water, and air here. And we acknowledge to them, to their ancestors, and to their descendants that we have an obligation to remember this, to recall it, to acknowledge it out loud, to co-labor in the present, so that we can go forward into the future together in a healthy and hopefully safer and happier environment. Yay, go potential futures. So we are here together. So this event here today is part of the Hot Off the Presses series, in which we celebrate publications by faculty at UC Riverside, predominantly from the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. If you like what you see here, I'll be dropping some links into the chat. You're welcome to subscribe to our newsletter so you can learn more about our programming. Later on, I'll also be dropping some links so you can learn more about Bella and Tina's work. So you're welcome to follow those or look as you listen to the programming here today. As you will have noted, we are recording here today, so I'll be hovering in the background, making sure that we click those microphones off so we can hear our speakers, so that folks who cannot join us at this hour can watch the recording later and follow along with us. As you are listening, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in that chat window. Feel free to check in with each other and say hello. You won't bother the speakers if you do this as they go along. It will help us out in the question and answer period. If you do put a question there, that you just start that with the word question. So as we're quickly scanning, we can see your questions and include as many of your voices as possible. So the format today will be, I will stop talking eventually, imminently. I will cease speaking. I will hand the virtual microphone over to my co-host to introduce our speakers. We'll hear from our speakers for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Hopefully answers, questions and explorations. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Georgia.
Hello, everyone. I am here to perform the function I always perform, which is to introduce speakers to people who know them better than I do. But in my role, and I think we're a small enough group that if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, I'll be able to see you and call on you. So Dr. Bella Merlin, as you all know, is an actor and professor of acting and directing here at UCR. She has 30 years experience on stage and screen, including 3 seasons at Shakespeare Company. She is the author of several books on acting, and the 2016 through 17 recipient of the McSweeny McCauley Endowed Chair in Teaching Excellence in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Tina Packer, our other speaker today, is a multi-award-winning founding artistic director of Shakespeare Company and has acted or directed all of Shakespeare's plays, as well as touring her original take on Shakespeare's Women of Will. Her book of the same name was the New York Times Editor's Choice. So without my further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bella now.
Well, first of all, a huge thank you to Catherine and Georgia and the Center for Ideas and Society for hosting this event. And a huge thanks to somebody I consider a deep inspirer and a personal mentor and friend, Tina, for joining us today. She's coming to us from Massachusetts, the depths of Massachusetts. Really delighted to be doing this. The way we're going to pan this event out is that I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how the book even came to be. Then I'm going to hand over to Tina, who's going to talk about why this book specifically was a manifestation of many years of experimentation and currently expertise. And then back to me to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be doing practices research in acting and the performing arts and manifesting through a book. and then open it out to everybody to share thoughts, provocations, etc. And I'm very grateful to have faculty and colleagues and the students from the current acting class I'm teaching, which is Shakespeare and the Power of Language. So we've been talking a lot about, obviously, the person in question, Shakespeare, but also just how significant our use of words is. So to kickstart us into this book, Shakespeare and Company, When Action is Eloquence, which is a quotation from Coriolanus, I'm actually going to read a little bit from the preface, partly because it does what I need it to do, and secondly, to give you a flavor of how accessible we tried to make this book. Nestled in the small town of Lenox, Massachusetts, is a hive of creative activity. Shakespeare and Company, as this story will detail, was the brainchild of British-born actor-director Tina Packer. Tina and I first met in 2012 at the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, where I'd been hired to play Margaret in her production of Richard III with actor Nigel Gore. Having recently emigrated from the UK, I was new to the American acting scene and hadn't yet heard of Shakespeare and Company. But soon after meeting Tina, I discovered we were both from the Midlands of England. My mum was born in the same town of Wolverhampton a month before Tina. So we kind of knew each other's pragmatic, risen working class stock. And I instantly loved her searing intelligence, no-nonsense truth-telling, and mischievous laugh. When she discovered I wrote books on acting, she gently suggested that I write one on Shakespeare and Company. Because my ignorance of the company at that time was embarrassing, I declined. She also gently suggested that I take their month-long intensive training for mid-career professionals held every January at their campus property in Lenox. Although I'd been working as an actor for 20-odd years at that point, including 5 years training in the UK and Moscow, I'm always curious to retune the instrument. And although Tina gave no hard sell, her voice resonated in my head for the next 3 years. In 2016, I took the month-long intensive. That transformative month made such an impact that at the end, I declared unequivocally, I would be honored to write your book. Later that year, I was cast in Shakespeare and Company's summer season, no doubt a pertinent Packer ploy to have me on site for 14 weeks. Thus, I was somewhat ethnographically embedded in the company, putting their training into practice, experiencing their performance processes, and gaining insights into their education programs. So we've tried to make this book very accessible, very interactive, if you like. You know, Tina and I are both actors, so we want the work to feel like it's going to lift off the page. And essentially, the book is an overview of a little bit of history of the company, which Tina created in the 1970s with voice guru Kristen Linklater. We then focus on the training, the actor training, which operates, as I've mentioned, for mid-career professionals, but then right across the board, really, from people just starting out on their career to extremely seasoned professionals. Their education program, which goes from 7-year-olds who can speak Shakespeare with amazing articulation, eloquence, and insight, through the prison program that they have, through outreach into the schools, as well as bringing children onto the campus. And then the last quarter of the book focuses on professional performance, their summer season. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because that's really where the kind of ethnographic element of being embedded in the company came to the fore for me. So that's how the book came into being. Now I'd like to suggest, Tina, you give us an overview. When we were talking about this the other day, the 3 words came up: experimenter, expert, and then inverted commas, expirer. I think of you as an inspirer, but I know there's a sort of imperative behind getting your work out there. So let me hand over to you for a while to talk to us about the company.
All right. I will. The expirer bit is important, because suddenly you find you're old, and suddenly at that moment you think, oh Christ, is my footprint going to be anywhere on this earth when I've expired? and none of you are at that point yet, but it's a very new feeling for me. I always think of myself somewhere around 17. So it came as quite a shock to me to suddenly think, oh God. And I think it has been exacerbated by my partner, Kristen Linklater's sudden death. So suddenly, the work was on the other side of the world. Anyway, I won't go into that a lot. Although, let me just tell you why I was so attracted to Bella, because I hadn't cast her in Richard III. The artistic director had. So she came to me as part of the production. But as she said, we did instantly have a rapport. But what she did, and I don't know how well you all know Richard III, but you know, Margaret is that mad woman who you wish would go away, who's always going on about the past and kind of bleating and wailing and I mean, she's very feisty, but she just won't shut up about what happened in the past. Well, it turns out, of course, that she is a manifestation of all the Henry VI plays. She's actually been in all the Henry VI plays, which means that Shakespeare was writing about Margaret longer than he was writing about any other character. So he actually knew her deeply. And I think it's one of the reasons why he began to understand women as opposed to, and really write from the inside of women, as opposed to writing about women or projecting on women. And of course, the Henry VI plays are his early plays. But the thing that was so astounding about what Bella did was that Margaret, you know, has a lover called Suffolk right in the very beginning, and he gets killed rather horribly, beheaded, and the head sent to Margaret. She has a husband, Henry VI, who also gets killed rather horribly by Richard, who becomes Richard III in the Tower. And she also has a son who gets killed on the battlefield. So the three prominent people in her life all get killed. And of course, in Richard, you're going towards the end of the play, and you don't know. I mean, you get the end of the Wars of the Roses, and you don't know all the stuff that's happened in the past. What Bella did that was so brilliant was that she carried around with her the skulls of these three people in a bag on her shoulder. And every time she started talking about them and what happened in the past, she'd bring the skulls out and line them up on stage. And it was not only electrifying, you also got her relationship to them. And I mean, it was a supreme piece of actors' skill and illumination. And we've actually stolen it as a piece of business ever since. So we do lots of education programs if they're doing scenes. But it is also historically true that Margaret carried around Suffolk's head for many months after he was killed, and they sent the head back to her. So I just wanted to tell you about Bella the actor, and just know what an inventive person she is. And the actor-director relationship in that moment solidified for me, and I knew this was a person I always wanted to work with. I thought, blimey, if you can think that up, that's extraordinary. And it was good storytelling as well. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. What was the next thing what was the question I'm meant to be answering, Bella?
Well, I love it. I love what you're doing, Tina, which is, you know, giving me this great high praise. But we're here to talk about your company and your book. So we could just,
well,
thank you, but it's about your book, your story.
Well, so, the reason I wanted the book written was because I didn't want all the work that we've done all these years just to disappear. Because, you know, I got it from people who've almost entirely disappeared now. And what I think I do as a human being is I'm like a magpie. I borrow things from everywhere. And bit by bit, it starts becoming mine. So you know, my first great introduction was on the structure of the verse from John Barton, who was my teacher at the Royal Shakespeare Company. But then I went on afterwards, and John helped us found Shakespeare Company. But then we went on afterwards, and because I was teaching it all the time, I was developing my ideas on structure. John Broome was my movement teacher and also the dance teacher at the Royal Shakespeare, and he taught Susan Dibble and taught other people. Kristen Linklater, of course, was the great dynamic force, but she got her work from Iris Warren, who was a voice teacher, prominent voice teacher in England, but she happened to live with a Harley Street shrink. So she was the first person who started connecting the emotional life and the voice. And then Kristen took it much, much further. B.H. Barry was the fight teacher, but then we started meeting with people who are experts on violence in the everyday world, and especially in the prison systems and things like that, and learned how violence really comes from shame and guilt, and but shame mostly. And so we started putting all these different disciplines together, and I just didn't want to get it lost. I didn't want it to get lost. And it seemed to me, it goes on into the education programs as well. I should say, one reason we put it in the country was because when I lived in London and was kind of, you know, jobbing actor, you get so wrapped up in who's in and who's out, and why did they get that part and not me, and then is the Times going to review my performance, and am I going to go up on the fame quota, and then when I got to New York is even worse, and I didn't like myself in that environment. I didn't like the competitor that I always became. It distracted me from the work in hand. So one reason we put it in the country was so that we wouldn't get distracted. And the other reason we put it in the country was so that we could see what effect we had on our local community. Because I was very kind of politically committed, and I wanted to know, could a classical theatre company actually affect the community it lives in? The answer to that is yes. It's not just economically. We're in all the schools doing the Shakespeare programs. You know, we sit on the town council. We do all these things, you know. I mean, but that was the other reason we put ourselves in the country, so that we could actually have a community that we were interacting with. But it did seem to me that we needed somebody who was in the theatre to write about what we were doing, not somebody outside the theatre, because so much of it is to do with the mind-body connection and how the body holds the score, as Bessel van der Kolk would say, who's another of the people we interact with who's not in theatre, but believes very strongly in the work we're doing and how that gets you to connect what's gone on in your life before. And of course, we use that for authenticity in acting, about how you're truthful on stage. Is that enough, Bella?
That's heaps and masses. And in fact, you know, I wonder whether I might, if this is okay with Catherine and Georgia, really gear this towards asking you some specific questions about things in the book, because many of the students and my faculty colleagues hear an enormous amount about me. I'd rather have you in the room and quiz you. So I wonder then if I could ask you, in the book, obviously you draw out the 5 key elements of Shakespeare's works that you felt were important for galvanizing a rounded actor and therefore somebody that could impact the community through theatre. Could you just take us through what those 5 Elizabethan elements are, and then how they get traced through the book?
Are you talking about the political, the psychological, the philosophical, and all that?
Not yet.
No.
Yeah, I'm doing structure of the verse, fight clown, structure of the verse.
Oh, thank you. You're talking about the disciplines that in fact the Elizabethan actors probably did as much as we do. So the first thing is the voice. In other words, you've got to free your natural voice so it can carry, but also that it picks up the nuance of everything that you're thinking and feeling. And so to free the natural voice, as Kristen would say, is enormously important. So I don't mean, like when I was at RADA, we had bone props, and we push our vowels to the front of the mouth, and we had this kind of upper class English that we were being taught. None of that stuff, none of that rubbish, I'm going to say. But to actually free the natural voice, you all know when a baby cries, everybody listens. Or if you're on an aeroplane with a young kid, it dominates everything because they've got very free and natural voices. So freeing the natural voice was the first thing. And then to have a body that can actually move and pick up all the impulses that are there. So not just be able to, because there's so much dancing in Shakespeare, not just be able to dance, but actually have a body that is very alive to what's going on with you. So for both of these things, the breath is absolutely key, to free the natural breath, to make sure that you're breathing so the oxygen is going through all the body all the time. And so then we go on to the fight element, which of course, obviously every Shakespeare actor needs to be a good fighter, but it's not just that you can fight and keep your partner safe, which is the discipline that we practice. It's also because of that safety, you're actually free then to indulge in murderous thoughts and thoughts of revenge, because you know nobody's really going to get hurt, because you've learned this discipline of how you fight, and you can free then all your emotions into your acting because you're going to keep your partner safe. Then there's the clown work, which is clowns dominated a lot of the Elizabethan world and the theatre. And there's that famous line, "Let the clowns do no more than is set down for them." Well, that was because the clowns always did more than was set down for them. And they were the stars in many ways, that people would go and see the clowns. And they were huge draws at the box office. But of course, they'd do what they liked. And the playwrights used to get mad because they'd go off on tangents and all that kind of stuff. But the clown work is essential because comedy is essential. So it's essential in its timing, it's essential in the perspective it gives the plays, and it's essential because they're talking to the audience all the time. And one of the things about Shakespeare's plays is that the audience is included all the time. Even if you're talking to other people on stage, your voice and your breath and your antennae are picking up the energy of the whole room. And if you're actually talking to the audience, if you're doing a soliloquy, which is, one of the great Shakespeare inventions, if I can put it like that, you're actually trying to bring the audience with you, but you're also very deeply listening to what the audience is giving you back. So that clown work is it's absolutely it's key. And I think again, when I think about what the function of the theatre is, it really is to tell the truth, is to bring what is unconscious to consciousness, is to speak what can't be spoken, and it's to do it in a collective space so that everybody can hear what's being said. And that you're creating an aesthetic which creates community. And you're talking about the most difficult things that a community needs to face. But because it's got beauty in it, and because it's got great form to it, you're not being shown the worst things in life without a real deep artistic core to what it is that's happening. And it was through mixing all these disciplines up I probably didn't, but the way Shakespeare's written the plays and how he's written them, the structure of the verse, when it's verse, when it's prose, when you're breathing, what you're talking about, what the figures of speech are, that gives it the elevation I always want to say, or it's life almost distilled. You know, it's the most truthful life, but it is distilled. And by mixing all these disciplines up and practicing them within the Shakespeare play, you're actually you're putting your mind and your body into a pressure cooker, but you're releasing it all the time. You're releasing it. So and the different disciplines really help each other to I know, for you to become an even more expansive human being than you already are. That's enough?
Yeah, that's absolutely terrific. And so that's been one of the main threads that we've taken through the book in many respects, how these 5 elements of Elizabethan theatre, I mean, what was it about? A theatre that was 400 years old, that could carry through, that could affect audience in a contemporary setting. So I think one of the challenges for us in creating this book was how to, I mean, I'm listening to you talk, and it's almost like you are the pressure cooker of human experience and human knowledge. So how to take the life force that not only is you, but is the company, because we tried to get as many different voices in, didn't we, in terms of the interviews that we had. We also, 3 of the chapters are 3 lectures that you give typically during the intensive, and we may, you know, you pretty much wrote them in the way in which you speak them so that they'd lift off the page. But I just wondered if you might attend to how the company from its beginning has aimed to be diverse and inclusive, through the professional company, through the education department, through the training department. I wonder if you could touch upon, first of all, why is Shakespeare relevant in a diverse community? And second, why is he relevant now? Why bother doing him now?
Right. Well, why bother doing him now is because he's speaking to so many situations that are now. I mean, he's the human behavior doesn't change that much, and human politics, even though they lived in a monarchy. You might notice that he writes about monarchies. He also writes about republics under Rome that then goes to an empire. But he also writes about kind of utopian places like, you know, the Forest of Arden, where everybody's equal and there isn't a kind of hierarchical system. So obviously in Shakespeare's own imagination, politically, he was ranging further away from just a monarchy. But what I wanted to say about the thing that we right from one of the reasons I liked working in America or coming to America was because it was a multiracial country. And so I was at NYU for 6 months, and they are pretty multiracial. You know, each class is people come from everywhere, and what I found when I worked with multiracial teams was that you had to go deeper and further to actually find the connection, because when you're acting Shakespeare, you're bringing the whole of yourself to the part, and yourself isn't just yourself, it's your parents, it's your grandparents, it's, as you said, we both came from Wolverhampton. For those of you that don't know, it's a terrible city in the middle of England, and they talk like this because all their soft palates have been so wrecked because there's so much coal dust, nobody will raise their, anyway, you understand, there's everybody brings all their heritage with them. And what we found was, as we got more and more deeply into who the human being was, that we could find the connections between us, and it also came out of this history. So the fact that, you know, when we were doing Romeo and Juliet, let's just say, so Juliet was Japanese, Canadian Japanese, her father was Joe Marcel, who you probably all know as the butler on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, although maybe that's a bit old. But anyway, he was from the island of St. Lucia, but had lived in England most of the time, and then had just come over to join us in there. And the mother was a kind of waspy person from the Berkshires. So here we had this family, and then so how to get to the essence of why this is a family, how deeply they're a family, and what the mores are, even though everybody came from different places. And we found that we could get there, that it was possible to actually get the father and daughter relationship, and in a way it enriched the picture. It was more enriching because it allowed us to know this is humanity. So although we've made a family from different parts of the globe, we actually are looking at parents and children and their universality. So we found it really deepened our work. And what we also had to do, though, was devise ways of being with each other. So because we're language based, because Shakespeare leads with language and the visual supports the language, if I can put it like that, we always felt we could talk things through. In other words, we would take what was common with us, and then if we made mistakes, which we inevitably did, or were crass or unfeeling or just unconscious, we would always talk everything through. We all believed in language, and it held us in good stead. We also, learned things about it's much easier to discuss things if there's less than 6 people in the room. If you get more than 20 people in the room, then it gets to be a whole different thing. So the level at which the intimacy you can get in discussing was also very much a part of the way in which we ran ourselves. But we always believed that if you could articulate what was going on, then we could find a way through. Does that make sense?
This is great, Tina, because it's made me also realize one of the significant things that we touch on in the first quarter of the book is actually that when you formed this company, you all lived together in the Mount, which was the writer Edith Wharton's home initially. So we're talking about a stately home full of a bunch of hippie actors, if I may put it like that. So I wonder, this is a really kind of unique story. And although the book was too short for us to do a complete history of the company, we focus more on the practical acting elements of training, education, and performance. But maybe for those in the midst who might be at the younger stages of their careers, could you share a little bit about what it meant to create a theatre company with everybody living in the same house in this extraordinary fairy tale environment of the grounds of Edith Wharton's house?
I know, but they were all unkempt and the house was falling apart. So one of the things we would do would be always have 2 hours of duty to build our home, so paint the walls or mend the shutters or, make sure the driveway didn't have potholes in it. So when our audience drove down the driveway, they wouldn't break their axles. So always there was 2 hours of work on the property, as well as our rehearsal time and our classroom work. So we were doing all those things. But I think when you have a passion for doing something, and nobody came who didn't have a passion for the way we were working. In other words, they found it illuminating for themselves as actors, even though everybody had been pretty much through a 3-year training program somewhere, either in England or in America. The density to which we went much further than you go in ordinary acting school, and so you didn't come if you didn't want to work really hard. And I mean, one of the things about living together is you're cooking for each other and you're hanging out at meal times. So there's a very, it both is a real intimacy. And of course you can go off to your own room, but lots of people didn't have their own room. They were sharing it with somebody else, you know, but there was this real sense of supporting each other. And that first year we only earned $50 each. The second year we won $200 each, which was more in 79 than it is now, but it still wasn't riches by any manner of means. And we had to have all kinds of waivers from equity, which they gave us surprisingly. But it was a sense of trying to create something and not feel that that there was anything you couldn't say. And it was very egalitarian. I mean, the way I direct is very egalitarian. It's by listening to what the actors have to say. It's by asking, what does this mean? It's by, so I follow Shakespeare's structure, and I ask questions about the predicaments that we're in, and I build that out of what the actors say. So I direct I don't do, you know, this is my concept of the play and you will all fulfill my concept. I feel as if I've really, that doesn't mean to say I don't do some conceptual things at the end to unify the play, but I'm really interested in how this person playing this part, what that happens. So to go back to the whole thing of ethnicity, because people would bring themselves to the part, then it worked. I can't describe, it worked. It just worked. And we built relationships both in living there in the house, and we've kind of felt Edith Wharton was supporting us, you know. And of course it wasn't anywhere as grand as it was when she lived there. But it also meant, I know the community loved us. They would come and see us. They would support us. I remember calling up the plumber and saying, all our pipes have broken, and he got himself down there to mend them for us, and he didn't charge us anything, you know. So it just worked somehow. I think we were so idealistic.
But I don't know that you could have done it without that idealism, could you?
I don't know.
Idealism and a certain, dare I put it this way, sort of ignorance, you know, to just dive in.
No, absolutely. But it came out of my being so angry at Peter Hall and you know, the RSC, because we were, you know, we would have group discussions, the associate artists. So that was 40 or 50 of us who were associate artists, and we'd have discussions about where the company was and what was coming up and all those things. And then we'd all feel we'd made our contribution, and then Peter would go off and do exactly what he wanted to do. Now, maybe politically, I was a bit more generous later on when I realized the outside political pressures, when I started getting those as well. But it really pissed me off at the time, because I thought, well, why bother to ask us what we think and make us feel? So a lot it was because I was really cross. And I was really cross because I was a woman, and I felt I wasn't being listened to half the time, you know, because my perceptions were different. So being cross is actually quite a good idea. You know, it gets you going.
Before we turn it over to questions, I wondered if you could touch upon briefly how the content of the book dialogues with recent events, whether it's in terms of the word fight, for instance, which, yes, as we saw last week in the Senate, was used in a montage.
Yeah, again. Yeah.
And also our connection to story, even if that story then becomes a conspiracy theory. Whether you could talk a little bit about why this is relevant even as we speak.
Right. Well, I just want to say, you know, the conspiracy theory is a really good story, if I can put it like that. It's a really good story. If you don't like the story of how our politicians work, and you don't like the story of how Congress works and things like that, and you want a really good story, the conspiracy story is a really good story. The fact that it's false is you know, it's terrible, because that means people are doing awful things out of that story. But the potency of the story itself is what theatre's about. That idea of a powerful story that a lot of people can align themselves and see their lives there. But I was going to say, you know, the reason why Shakespeare's stories are so powerful is because in the end, lives are illuminated by it, not destroyed by it. And so that's why the authenticity of the story is enormously important. And by authenticity, I don't necessarily mean journalistically, I mean authentic in its aesthetic principles, that the actual story is one that ignites our imagination and shows us the way through. It has an ethical stand behind it. And so the story itself is enormously important. To be articulate in your language is enormously important. And to be able to define actually what's going on, which is why the schools program is so successful. The kids who do the Shakespeare plays, and there's an awful lot of them. I mean, it's about 350 kids every year, maybe even up to 500, who are actually participating in the education programs and then coming together for a big tent play Shakespeare festival. They become very articulate, and they're very good at being able to find their way into the truth of what it is that's going on. And I think there's no, and one of the reasons that the program in the justice system works so well is partly because those kids have never had any language to be able to articulate what's going on. And once they start getting the idea that language can actually say where they are, then they start growing in so many other ways as well, and that they're listened to, that they're listened to. We've about fight in particular. we've called it so many things, you know, but the fight work, the combat work, the physical action work. Tony Smotis likes to say it's a line of physical action. You know, that happens to have, you know, the knife going in or the cudgel about you. So how you actually name something and it is important, and language is important to us. I don't know where we are quite on how we articulate the I'm going to call it physical action work right now. But what it does do is allow you, because Shakespeare's such a good psychologist, he doesn't do violence in his plays unless he's trying to show you what leads to that violence. And you can see it very clearly in a play like Macbeth, because Macbeth is telling you what he's thinking and feeling all the time. You know, after really Lady Macbeth shames him into killing Duncan, then he can't stop. And so what happens what happens if you break your own inner moral compass? What happens to you then? And you know, the same is true of Othello to many. So what I'm trying to say is Shakespeare is such a deep psychologist, even though they didn't call it psychology at the time, that you can see why people are violent. He never does gratuitous violence, or he shows at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, this is a load of gratuitous violence and look where it leads to. Do you know what I mean? In other words, he's not putting it in so he's going to sell more seats. He's putting it in so you can see what it is that he's doing.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Tina. I'm aware that we're already at 3:47. So I suppose it would be timely for me to hand to Georgia for Q&A. And I'm aware some of the students from my class may have to duck out at some point, but I also know some of them have got questions. So Thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand, and I will see it. I have two questions that came before the event. One is from Arit Jaffe-Berg. Can Bella speak a little bit about her archival research process? Did she develop a particular method of assembling and organizing the materials? Also, can she share with us one discovery or surprise she met with during the research process?
Well, I was very lucky in that the summer that I was there, 2016, happened to coincide with the summer that a group called the Oral History Archive Project, who were all volunteers, many of them retired teachers, librarians, historians, had started getting the boxes of press cuttings and moldering photographs down in flooded basements. They'd already started an archival process. And if that hadn't happened, I don't even know where I would have begun. And they'd started categorizing things. They had about 9 categories. Some were to do with things like budget and management. Well, I knew I wasn't going to be covering that, but there was clearly one on training, clearly one on education, clearly one on the performance, yes, and then a whole file on Tina. So to some extent, they'd begun quite a lot of the work for me. But I mean, one of the joys was, because I was blessed to be cast in, the book took 3.5 years. And for 3 of those years, I was in summer productions. So it meant if I wasn't in the rehearsal room or on the stage, I was in the archive, and I practically lived in the archive. So, and at that point, what I was doing really was making massive amounts of photocopies of press cuttings, because it's only beginning to become digitalized. And then I would brought them all back to the West Coast when the summer season finished, and that's when I would archive that. That's when I would go through and pick out all the little quotations. It was a very joyous and a very overwhelming activity, but I think it would have been even more overwhelming, well, no question, had the Oral History Archive Project not been running. And they became kind of partners in crime. Every year, Tina and I would meet up with them and let them know what the next stage was, and they helped me with the illustrations, and they helped me fact check things. So I was really lucky to have this group of very, very feisty retired people who wanted to be part of this process. The biggest surprise, I mean, there were many surprises at many turns, but one of the big privileges I actually had was Tina's generosity, as she'd put a lot of her notebooks into the archive. So I was reading all sorts of little tiny scribblings of director's notes, or often very personal notes. And I even said to Tina, you know, if you're going to make this archive public, you probably just want to double check what you've put in there. What that enabled me to do was to really feel the life force of this theatre company, and to whilst obviously they're no longer based at Edith Wharton's house, I was given a kind of backstage tour of where they had been living, where their living quarters were, and you know, the house is supposedly haunted, and I swear to goodness that there was the ghosts of old productions in there as much as anything else. So I was really able for 3 whole summers to be on a level of DNA, really, in a really privileged way, immersed in archiving at every level, in my own body, as well as what I was reading through the newspapers and the notebooks.
Here's another question, comes from Lily Hart. I was wondering about the practice of dropping in. How does that function with characters in Shakespeare who are eavesdropping? That is, the lines that are being said aren't being directed at the other characters in the scene. Do you still have actors make eye contact and sit close to each other if there's supposed to be distance between them?
So I introduce them a little bit, Tina, to the practice of dropping in. So this is a very specific question on rehearsal processes.
Yes, I think you can do it whichever way you want to, but I probably, if they're whispering to each other, would probably have them close their eyes as they're doing it. So everybody knows they're sitting eyeball to eyeball. The chairs are really up close. They're in an open position. They're breathing deeply, and they stay in eye contact as we go through the words in the play one by one and ask questions about those words. That's how dropping in basically works. And you don't censor anything. You let yourself, whatever comes up, comes up. It's a way of kind of plugging into your unconscious mind. But if you're doing something like whispering to each other and not seeing, I would probably start off eyeball to eyeball, and then I'd probably ask them to close their eyes and maybe start whispering word by word and still drop it in to see what came up. If it didn't yield results, then I'd have them open their eyes again. But I think it might yield something, it would mean the hearing would become even more dominant. So there's no really hard and fast rules other than remaining in an open position. You know, don't hurt yourself or the other person or the furniture. Stay in eye contact, allow what comes up to come up, and don't censure anything. And you know, so I might play with it a bit in those circumstances, but I don't know, I'd have to see if it worked or not. Do you know what I mean? It would just have to see how it played out.
Okay, here's a question from Stu Krieger. What are the main challenges of trying to make Shakespeare accessible and relatable to today's students with their short attention span and addiction to the shorthand language of social media?
Well, the honest truth is you start working on the play, and what happens is they do start loving the play. If they can get the personal connection to the people that they're playing, then the whole thing starts unraveling from there. I mean, that the language to be able to say it with. But I don't know that you can necessarily talk anybody into loving Shakespeare. I think you have to do Shakespeare to love Shakespeare. And one of the things is that I was thinking about this earlier. You know, what happens now is when we don't know something, we just Google it. Whereas with Shakespeare, they learned everything, they memorized everything. So they would memorize all the books they had in school, they would memorize it. They would read something and they would memorize. So who was the computer in Shakespeare's time was their brains. Do you understand me? They were cross-referencing, you know, what they read in school with what was interesting to them now, to what Holinshed Chronicles said, to what the pronouncement that the Queen had made last week. They're memorizing all those things. So their brains are the memory bank. That's a very different proposition than when you just look up something and you forget it the next moment after you've looked it up and got the answer. So it actually is shifting. The computers are shifting the way in which we think. I can only tell you that I know when people start getting into Shakespeare, then they really, and when I say getting into Shakespeare, I don't just mean reading Shakespeare. I mean being Shakespeare, enacting Shakespeare, reacting with other people. It gives you avenues of depth that you didn't think were possible. It gives you avenues of openness and honesty that you didn't think were possible. And the words are saying it for you. And then that in turn stimulates who you are psychologically and physically as a person, and starts expanding your own mind, your own intelligence. I mean, I think I got clever because of Shakespeare's plays. I don't know how clever I was before. I was never top of the class or anything like that. But I got clever through doing Shakespeare's plays, you know, be able to write books and things like that through Shakespeare's plays, and, you know, talk to 3,000 people at one time. I can only say say the words, say them out loud, say them to somebody and see what comes up. And I know that's a very different thing from, and if they don't want to do it, I don't know how you get them to do it. You don't.
Do you have follow-up questions, Stu? Okay, so we have a question from Catherine Henshaw. What does the future look like for the company? Are any new directions or possibilities you wish for post-COVID? If there is post-COVID.
Can we say that there's the new space that's just been built? That's in the process.
I think we can. Well, it hasn't been built yet. It's about to be built. Yeah. So yeah, we're hoping to get up this summer. First of all, I want to say all our friends and supporters have been incredible, and they have really seen us through this hard time. We were all off payroll for a couple of months and on unemployment. It was very funny. I haven't been on unemployment for 50 years, but I was back on unemployment. So then we went back on 80%, and now we're back on 100%. And but that's because of our supporters. They've been incredible. I can't tell you, not just the board of trustees, but they have been as well. I mean, they've been leading the way, but our audiences members, our volunteers, they've all been incredible and sent us enough money for us to be able to keep operating and start planning for the summer. So we're so grateful to them. And we've been doing performances online, but that, and then asking for donations, but that's a secondary thing. So I do think that I think the company is going to survive, let me put it like that. And then what we've decided to do for this summer, because Massachusetts has been going backwards and forwards, we're building a new outdoor space. I mean, the fact that we can even say we're going to build a new outdoor space, I mean, it will probably cost us about $500,000, but people have stepped forward and said, we don't want to be without our Shakespeare this summer. Build an outdoor space. So we're building a 350-seat outdoor space, and maybe it will only house 50 or 100 people in it, but at least we'll be performing. And I don't know whether we're going to be able to have the workshops or not. We've been teaching a lot on Zoom, and I don't know whether we'll be able to have the education programs, but we will be able to have the young company because they can work in this outdoor space. So we'll be socially distanced, and but we're going to do it. We're going to be outdoors, unless something catastrophic happens, which is just excellent. So yes, we're going to survive.
We're at the hour mark. Any further questions? Closing comments, Bella?
There's something very empowering about speaking Shakespeare's texts, and several of the people that are in the room, as I say, are currently doing the Shakespeare class, and I've been so deeply inspired by the work that they've been doing. And it's clear that actually once one gets over the hurdle of thinking, I don't understand it, it's not how I'd speak normally, but then suddenly giving oneself permission to use juicy words and to connect to the actual feeling of words in the mouth. I've been so inspired by what the students have done. And I also add that doing Shakespeare outside is just heaven on a stick, because then you can, the sky is literally the limit. No decision is too big when you're out.
Yeah.
And just a huge thank you.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah. Just wanted to say a huge thank you, Tina, for finding time to do this, for ever asking me to pioneer the book and share all this journey with you, and to the Center of Ideas and Society for hosting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both.
Yeah. Oh, Bella, I can't thank you enough for doing it. Really, a real act of love. real
There's
act
an
of
audio
love.
book coming out as well, March the 29th. For those of you who've got lots of driving you might be doing, or simply don't want to sit reading anymore, the audio book, which features predominantly myself and Tina, but then a multitude of other Shakespeare Company actors, it will be available on Amazon, Google Books, and somewhere else as well, Audible, on March the 29th.
Good. Well, we have a comment
Yay.
from Hannah Hyatt, which says, I love what you said about having to do Shakespeare to love it. I tried it for the first time in Bella's class, and the skills I gained from performing his work have made me a stronger actor.
Good. That's exactly what I mean.
Thank you, Hannah. And Hannah's a terrific actor anyway, so to be even better is even more joyous.
Yeah.
Hi, I just want to put a face to my comment. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Bella. Thank you, everyone, for setting this up.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Bella and Tina. This was terrific. It makes me even want to be an actor, although that would be really dreadful for everyone.
Well, you should do it anyway.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you back
Thank
here
you.
for our next book talk.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you. Lovely being with you. Beautiful being with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.